It is 9 p.m. on March 30th, which means we have just a little bit over 24 hours left in the month of March. While there's a lot of exciting stuff going on in April, we are also on a deadline. That deadline is that by the end of tomorrow, I need to have decided on what I want to recommend for the library reads list. So today what we're going to do is we're going to read the first chapter of the 7 arcs that I have that are being published in May. To vote for a title in Library Reads, you don't have to have finished the book. You just have to, you can literally just nominate all of them. But what I like to do is I like to read the first chapter of each book, and then if it's something that I find really fascinating or I think stands out in any way, then it's something that I will vote for prior to reading the work in its entirety or providing any sort of review. We don't have to go through these in any particular order, so I figure that we should just go by order of publication. So one of the first books that is being released in May is Overgrowth by Mira. It releases on May 6th. For anyone that doesn't know, Mira is a pseudonym used by Shauna McGuire. So while my only experience with Mira so far is with my current read, I'm currently in the middle of Parasite. I have read a few of the novellas in the Wayward Children series. I don't remember much about this particular title, but knowing that it's authored by Mira, that means that it is going to be definitely more horror leaning. That took an hour and 20 minutes. Oh my God. There was a 7-part prologue that wasn't called a prologue, and then a 3-part first chapter. And it's specifically called first chapter, chapter 1. So I felt like I had to read through the end of that. That was just a lot. I found the formatting of the book itself familiar, since it kind of follows the same setup as Parasite. The little sections within the chapters itself were kind of annoying. I didn't love it. And that is missing from Parasite, so thank goodness. But there's like supporting stories, passages from articles. In the case of Overgrowth, it was sometimes report cards. So that, in a way, that's following the same kind of setup. And then like also the very introductory stuff is more, it's a little bit more clinical. It's not to make it sound like sterile and stilted and boring. It's more just to the point, less character focused. So that was pretty much the exact same as my experience with Parasite so far. About halfway through reading those 2 chunks of text, I was already feeling like slumpy. Not like I don't want to read anything ever again, like not a reading slump, but like this project slump. I was definitely considering canceling this entire video because of how long that was happening. I'm sure I read the synopsis for Overgrowth at one point, but I don't remember anything about it. But from what I gather, it has something to do with aliens. In this very introductory prologue part, it's simply titled The Story, and there are 7 sections within it, and in each section, we're essentially following a stage of this alien life being introduced to Earth, like how it happens. It's a plant-based alien life, which is kind of fascinating. So we're following that from the very beginning. It comes from a comet, like that's the initial seed comes from a comet that hits Earth, and these seeds are spread all over the Earth, but we're following a particular seed that has landed in Washington. Then one of the sections in there, now we're following a different perspective of a little girl named Anastasia that plays a very pivotal role in this introduction to this alien meets world interaction. I would definitely check trigger warnings before getting too deep. Like even in this intro, there's some things that happen that maybe some readers would not want to read about. The major thing being that 3.5-year-old Anastasia wanders off into the forest and is consumed by this plant that has sprouted from this seed that landed from the comet that I mentioned earlier. The comet. Did I say comet? 3 days later, a new life emerges. Mira Grant does an excellent job capturing the innocence and inexperience of youth. In this opening passage, there's already been a fairly tragic event. It doesn't get super into like body horror, but there's definitely this atmosphere of terror that is woven through the storytelling. And then, as seems to be the usual, chapter 1 is now jumped into the future to 2030, where we're exploring a little bit more of the results of the climate crisis and what this near future looks like. All of it seemed fairly reasonably believable. I mean, maybe barring the alien plant human that is our main character. In the prologue, we see the birth of Anastasia, and Anastasia never hides who she is. Even as a child, even as a 3.5-year-old, she tells her mother that she's an alien and that there is going to be an invasion in the future. And she has lived her life this way, just being very open with it. Like Parasite, there is a therapy element to this story, this introduction to the story. And I found that actually really funny because this is somebody that is an alien or is fully convinced that they are an alien. They've disassociated completely from their species. And it was just entertaining to think of this alien being treated for depression and disassociation and all of these very human afflictions that apparently are not only contained in the human experience. Anastasia is still somebody that needs to go to work, and we're seeing what that work looks like in this year of, I think it's 2031 in the book, so this not so distant future, like literally 6 years from now, we're seeing what that's like and how things have evolved. And it turns out it's really not that different. But how this portrait was captured did give me like Black Mirror vibes. Specifically, there's one episode of Black Mirror where to pay off your debt, you have to ride a bicycle to generate electricity for those that aren't in debt, I would assume. So I just felt some very similar Black Mirror vibes. And then one last thing to note is that very explicitly underneath the, chapter 1 and then the date, there seems to be a countdown to the incoming invasion. So that's why, I'm pretty sure that we're dealing with an actual alien life form that is living a very human life. So in the interest of not making this like a relative rating scale. I'm just gonna like, because usually what I do is like I will find, or I'll read a chapter and then I'll be like, oh, I liked that. But then I'll go through my list and be like, oh, I liked it better than this, but not as much as this. And then I'll like put it, then I'll kind of like give it a rating based off of that. But maybe I'll just do it based off of today's feelings on how that goes. So I found Overgrowth intriguing, but like I said, it really destroyed me how long the intro and the first chapter was. That was an hour and a half of my life that I definitely thought was only going to take half an hour. And I do think that that's going to affect how I feel about this. It's just part of it. So is it intriguing? Yes. I really want to see how Anastasia the alien goes through life. Like, I think that's going to be really cool. I'm excited to see this eventual alien invasion. I mean, I don't think it's going to be a typical alien invasion, like end of the world, green-eyed men coming in spaceships. I don't think it's that kind of invasion. So it's like, I want to know more about that. I want to know more about this near future world, but am I intrigued enough to want to sit and read through such gigantic chapters? I'm somebody that loves little tiny chapters. The one that I think of is The Night Guest here. If you look in The Night Guest, there's like some chapters are literally one sentence, which maybe that's a little exaggerated, but I love super short chapters because I can just read a few pages, put it away, and I've made progress. I'm now 2 chapters further than I was 10 minutes ago, versus 1 chapter further than I was an hour and a half. I can't get over it. So for this one, I think I'm going to give this an intrigue rating of 9 out of 10. It just feels right. Releasing on the same day as Overgrowth is Brighter Than Scale, Swifter Than Flame by Neon Yang. This one is a novella with a page count of just 176 pages. This one is definitely fantasy leaning and has like an amazingly cool cover. See, now that one took less than probably 10 minutes. I didn't even time it. That's how fast that first chapter was. It's a novella, that makes sense. As far as first chapters go, this was not the best ever. The story in general actually sounds like we're getting a good setup for it, but the beginning is kind of like it's like starting the sentence once upon a time, and then that's it. So it's essentially setting up the world a bit. We're introduced to the concept of the Sun Empire. We're aware now that there are guild knights that slay dragons, and it's mostly talking about the stories that are told about this guild knight and all of their conquests. And this passage here is probably the most intriguing part of this entire first chapter. It says, in their tellings, the masked guild knight never shows any weakness. They are never hurt and they are always victorious, as they should be. But we know better, of course. How could we not? We who are kin to the dragons surely know the names of our own grandmothers and of the lives they led. And so that's like towards the very end of this very introductory first chapter. It brings up so many questions. We who are kin to the dragons, is this like a guild knight that maybe doesn't know they have dragon blood or are a dragon, or I don't know. It's very curious. I then read the synopsis, since that was such a tiny little bite of what the story is about. Reading the synopsis, there's definitely sapphic vibes, and there is it's following one particular guild knight who is being tasked with slaying a particular dragon and protecting the Sun Queen. There's definitely like a bigger adventure story in here, but we're definitely not given that in that first chapter. So like what, a 0 is like, wow, that was the worst thing ever. I mean, I don't know if I would ever rate a first chapter a 0, but maybe a 1. Like, wow, that was terrible. I don't want to read this anymore. And then maybe a 5 or a 6 would be like a meh. And then a 10 was like, wow, my God, that was so good, right? That seems like a reasonable thing. And so like, it's definitely closer to a meh, but it feels not good. No, like feeling like, because we got some groundwork for like what might be a really cool story. I keep waffling back and forth. So I'm going to say that I'm going to give Swifter Than Scale and Brighter Than Scale, Swifter Than Flame a 6.5 intrigue rating out of 10. Next up, we're going to be checking out a book called Anji Kills a King by Leikam. I was sent a digital copy of this to check out, and I will admit that I don't remember if I even read the synopsis. From the fact that it was published by Tor and from the cover alone, I think that I just thought that I would probably get along with that. So hopefully this first chapter proves me right. Okay, that was a roller coaster. The prologue for Anji Kills a King was just so awesome. It was immediately the titular event was happening, which I feel like that happens, like I think that's a device some authors use to give you the big bang of action, and then we go into what's leading up to this moment, or perhaps it's the fallout after said thing happens. This followed the latter of the two options, and it was just like totally different. It was, I don't know, like how different the first chapter and the prologue were. It was like complete whiplash. Like two different people were writing these two parts, or it's very confusing. I don't know. Anyway, let's back up. So the prologue. In the prologue, a laundress that lives in this castle has just murdered the king and is gathering her things to run away into the night. And how she's reacting to what she did, you don't necessarily get the feeling that there's guilt involved, but she's experiencing tunnel vision. It's a very shocking thing that just happened. She's trying to wash the blood off of her hands. It's this very dramatic thing. And I don't know, just in these very few pages, you get this idea of who this character is. And then we hit chapter 1. So now Anji has cut off her hair in an attempt to hopefully fly under the radar and not throw off any indication that she is the person that matches the wanted poster. When she's escaping this kingdom, she pays an old farmer to like hitch a ride on his wagon, and then she eats a couple of turnips and he gets mad and kicks her off. That's a who cares? And so then after that, she's stumbling around in the cold and she comes upon a bar, and or tavern probably is what we're calling this. She stumbles upon this tavern, and it's like we're dealing with a totally different character. Suddenly there's like everybody's a sod, and she's swearing left and right, which I don't have a problem with swearing, but it's just like this character you have built in the very short prologue is just not the same person that you're seeing in chapter 1. And I don't know why I'm holding so solidly onto that feeling of a character that I have from the prologue, but it just doesn't match. There's something that's just super fractured with the characterization of this particular character. And maybe it's the fact that the character that we're discovering in chapter 1, I don't like her. She enters this tavern, ends up playing what seems like something like poker. There's just different words substituted in for the numbers and suits, but it sounds very much like just poker. And she's counting cards. And so that's kind of a cool thing to know that that was something that she learned to do when she was growing up. But other than that, I don't know, like we don't really learn much about this character. And there's just a lot of anger in this interaction with the people that she's playing cards with. Well, how did she come into a tavern and just start playing cards with random people? Like, it's just like so many, there's like holes in what's happening, and the character is terrible. And I don't know. As far as intrigue goes, like I'm telling you, if it had continued on that trajectory with that prologue, that was a 10 out of 10 prologue. But first chapter, that was an absolute nightmare. So, I mean, I honestly, I feel like I just can't give it anything higher than a 4. 4s are usually reserved for things that I mean, I obviously didn't like this. So, I mean, I guess 4 is pretty accurate, but it's just like completely unexpected. Upon reading the synopsis, it does sound like there might be some redeeming things to this story. There seems to be some like political intrigue woven into this, but it doesn't become clear in the first chapter. And I don't feel confident in the political intrigue improving my opinion of this story. I don't know. I just really thought that I was gonna like this more than I did. So 4 out of 10 is first chapter intrigue rating. That's what we're going for. Anji Kills a King and the next 3 are all releasing on the same day, which is on May 13th. Next, we're going to be checking out Awake in the Floating City by Susanna Kwan. This was another one that was sent to me by the publisher. I know that it had more of a dystopian flair and maybe leans more sci-fi, and so that intrigued me a lot. As far as I remember, it follows a caretaker that is hired by an older woman to either be a companion or a caretaker in this building that is one of the few buildings that remains as the world continues to fill with water. This is one of a couple books on my radar that have to do with that concept of the world being inundated with flooding. I think in general, I just find that concept really intriguing. The only thing that makes me kind of unsure about this one is that I am not sure about the interpersonal interactions, connections. I don't know if that's going to be something that I like or not, but we'll see where this first chapter takes us. Awake in the Floating City. This was not, did I say dystopian? Definitely not dystopian. This is like near future, early pre-apocalypse. It's not the world has ended. It's the world is adapting to the aftermath of the climate crisis, where in some areas water has completely dried up. In others, such as in this future San Francisco, it has rained for 7 years solid. So while this story does have speculative elements, we are exploring this future that could possibly be a reality or something close to it. While those speculative elements do exist, this first chapter is showing that the book is going to be more about how humans adapt, and not even just like the new infrastructure or how society changes and the social constructs that evolve with this new world. We're seeing examples of how business continues on. Street vendors were the first to go up to the rooftops to continue in a new way in this new world. This new world being full of buildings that have become islands within this drowned city. Things that we think of as just part of our world, schools, workplaces, residences, everything has moved up and life adapts. People that have lived with life, with the world as we know it today, have to learn to adapt and accept this new way of life. And we are following a character named Bo, and we don't know much. I think that is the character that I was talking about earlier, that is the older woman that is living alone, and her mother went missing a couple of years ago. We don't know. Her picture is up like in the elevator. I'm assuming that's kind of like your main way of going up and down through your life. That's how you are traveling through your world now, is through an elevator. So her mother is missing and she leads a solitary life. And it's just going through the quiet traditions of her everyday life, the rituals. So from this first chapter, there's like maybe a one-page prologue as far as I could tell on my ebook. You can definitely feel that this is going to be a very atmospheric read. It's going to be very reflective and really laid back. And there's a good chance that it's going to be emotional and cause you some feels. So I would definitely call Awake in the Floating City more intriguing than not. It's not the type of story that I would typically pick up, but it is something that I might return to just because I read that first chapter. Like maybe when I'm feeling like I want to read something just really mellow. I guess what some might call a palate cleanser. So this one is going to be landing on a 7 out of 10 intrigue rating. Currently, I'm really intrigued by this world, and I would really hope that we'll get more of an idea of what life in this world is now. It was almost giving me, if you're familiar with Harold Halibut, which is a game that was released, I believe, last year. That game is completely underwater, but it's still the same thing, traveling by elevator and life moving on, like continuing on despite everything that has happened. From that first chapter, it's just very obvious that this is going to be more about characters, relationships, and less about the science and the why behind the state of the world, which is the more intriguing part for me. But I don't know. There's still a bit that's like, there's still a bit of me that's hopeful that there's going to be some development in that particular aspect. So I am curious about this world that is being set up in this story. All right, next we're going to be checking out The Devils by Joe Abercrombie. I love this cover, but it does lead my brain to thinking that this is going to be a horror novel, when in fact, this is an epic fantasy. I don't know any details about said epic fantasy because, like I said, in my brain, it's very much stuck in horror mode because there's a skull with candles sticking off of it, which I can see why that could also be epic fantasy, but I just think that's really funny that my brain just can't let that go. I've never read anything by Joe Abercrombie, though I am a member of many communities that praise his works, his main series. I don't even remember the name of it. So this will be an opinion from somebody that does not have any preconceived notions on how this is going to go, besides the fact that I do know that Joe Abercrombie has written at least one epic fantasy series that people just absolutely love. This book is the longest one in this video, coming in at 560 pages. And so I fear this first chapter is going to be equally long. And if it is as long of a chapter as I think it's going to be, I hope I really, really like it so that it is time well spent. Okay, this first chapter was surprisingly short. The book is set up in a way where there's distinct parts, but there are not named chapters. There are just sections with titles within the parts. So I only read one of those titled sections. And in this first chapter, we're following a character named Brother Diaz. There seems to be some sort of fictional religion in this world, and Brother Diaz is late for something very important that I'm sure was kind of mentioned in the beginning, but I kind of don't remember. I think it's more that I don't have a strong enough grasp on this world just yet in this very short first chapter. What I wasn't expecting when I was reading this, especially after realizing that there was this strong religious tone, theme, subject going on, I was not expecting there to be a ridiculous amount of humor in it. At first, there was just like a healthy dose of amusement coming from what was written, and then that evolved into actually being pretty hilarious. There are dry bits of humor, such as this line, theology had never really been his strong suit, but he was reasonably sure the Savior had talked a lot about mercy. So, I mean, like a brother and theology is not his strong suit. That's dry humor, hilarious. Then there are moments that are less dry that just, I'm just like, so I love the humor in this already. So Brother Diaz is late and is trying to get the driver to hurry up. Just get him there. He'll pay double. Just get us there. Come on. And so he starts praying. Oh, blessed Saint Beatrix, he murmured, gripping it desperately. Holy martyr and guardian of our Savior's sandal. I ask for only this. Get me to my shitting audience with the Pope on time. I don't know. That's just like a couple of bits of humor, some more subtle than others. And I loved it. I thought it was so fun. So how does it rate on the intrigue rating though? while I would think that I'm gonna like this one a lot, I don't know if this was necessarily intriguing. Like, just from this first chapter, you want Brother Diaz to make it to his appointment, or for the Pope not to be mad at him. But am I intrigued? Do I know enough about what is to come? Like I said, this is an epic fantasy, and I didn't even know because I think that this is a horror cover. And still, I want to read on because I am thoroughly entertained already, just from this small morsel of the story. So I'm gonna give The Devils a 9.5 out of 10. Our luck has finally changed in this video, which brings us to our second to the last first chapter, which is from The Incandescent by Emily Tesh. I have yet to read anything by Emily Tesh, though I do know that she wrote Some Desperate Glory, which I do have a copy of and is on my to be read list. I've only heard good things about Some Desperate Glory, and I know it recently won the Hugo Award, so I am expecting good things from this author. The synopsis for The Incandescent is not super clarifying. I know it involves some sort of magical school, and we're mostly following a professor in this magical school. As far as I remember, she is somebody that teaches the more advanced classes. Then there's mention of some terrifying threat. Then by the end of the synopsis, it alludes to the fact that this professor might be the biggest threat that she needs to save the school from. So I don't know if it sounds as good as I'm already heard that this one is getting glowing reviews. So I don't think that the synopsis really does it a lot of favors. I'm expecting a lot more than what it's giving to me just from face value. Two absolute bangers in a row. That's so awesome. I'm so happy about that. This first chapter gets directly into the meat of things. I loved it. We are quickly introduced to the school and to the headmaster, not head professor or whatever I called her earlier. We meet Dr. Walden when she is trying to fill out a risk assessment form for a class that she's teaching in the morning. So we're learning about the form. I know this is gonna sound so boring, but we are learning about essentially the history of the form, like how the form came to be. And through this, we're introduced to this concept of a wizarding world that, instead of shying away and staying away from humans, they have integrated with, it's just like it's like an expanded version of our regular world. So this wizarding school has an IT department. It's just so good. Like, to me, this is a novel concept. It's like a fresh take on something that has just become like the norm of how we think of these wizarding school related worlds. So while there are these bits of modern technology that are mixed into this story already, there's also this concept of a marshal, which is essentially a police force that specializes in containing and dealing with demons. And these marshals are armed with super antiquated, like, short swords. And so that contrast is really fascinating. I love that mix, and I thought that it was done super well. In this first chapter, Dr. Walden is having a conversation with the head of the marshals in this school, and they're discussing a particular student that is both extremely gifted and who the marshal also deems extremely dangerous, because this character was somehow involved in the deaths of both her parents and her brother. So the marshal is really leery about her involvement in learning magic, while Dr. Walden views her from the other perspective of being one of the most talented students that she's ever taught. So just hearing about this conflict and like kind of getting, it's maybe not foreshadowing, but seeing the setup for this upcoming conflict, for this possibility of a conflict, was just like really fun. I really enjoyed my time just reading this first chapter. It makes me want to read the rest of the book immediately. Like, I'm hoping that I can somehow work it into my magical readathon TBR. And then The cherry on top is that there's just this little lick of humor that I just love when there's just this extra little entertaining bit. And this is the perfect example. Marshall Kenning is now leaving this conversation and says, "Did you know that clock is possessed?" Kenning said, gesturing to the wall clock. "I can sort it out for you." "That's quite all right," said Walden. "It's not doing any harm. It's a demon." "Only a very small one," Walden said soothingly. "Good night, Marshall." After Kenning was gone, Walden sat back in her chair and sighed, the risk assessment form glaring accusingly up from her desk. The wall clock, in an unusual burst of activity, gave out 13 very fast chimes and then manifested a cuckoo, which emerged with glowing red eyes, opened its beak, and screamed. It's just that little bit of extra flavor that just makes this such a solid story. Give me a really solid, meaty chunk of story and then sprinkle on some like little entertaining bits and you have me sold. And that is what The Incandescent has done for me today. I highly recommend this just based off this first chapter. And it goes without saying that this one got a 10 out of 10 intrigue rating from me. The first one of the night. And finally, we are to our very last first chapter rating, and that is The Starving Saints by Caitlin Starling, which is releasing on May 20th. This one very recently came on my radar, actually. I was watching one of Books Like Woe's most anticipated books that are coming up in the near future, and she mentioned this one, and it sounded really cool. It's horror and medieval, and I don't myself think I've ever really I know I've not read anything like that. And I don't even know if I've really heard of that combination before. So I was immediately intrigued by this. And the cover looks cool as hell. Caitlin Starling is the author of The Luminous Dead, which I have read the first chapter of. I actually read more than the first chapter. I gave the first chapter itself an intrigue rating of 9, so that was already pretty high. I got further into that book. I was planning on actually reading it. There was a moment when I was still trying to do hard mode for all the squares of the Our Fantasy 2024 bingo board, and I got to the point where I realized I couldn't do hard mode for everything. And so when I was still planning on doing hard mode, The Luminous Dead was one of the current book club picks. So that was my plan, was to read The Luminous Dead, participate in the discussion, and then be able to check off hard mode for that particular prompt. That ended up not happening. I didn't get super far into the book, but there wasn't a ton of character development yet, which I'm assuming just from the synopsis that was to come. So that one's still on my TBR. It's just kind of paused. I just left it as a first chapter. But what I did read, I enjoyed. That one was definitely a more sci-fi than anything, definitely horror elements. So yeah, this one's going to be kind of a flip-flop, but still in that horror realm, which I am looking forward to. I think this one's going to be good too. And we're hoping that it at least, meets the same level as this author's previous work. So it turns out the end of May is going to be filled with awesome new releases. I am so glad that I decided to check out The Starving Saints. It's definitely already set up some gothic horror vibes, but in this first chapter, we haven't seen a lot of the more supernatural things that are mentioned in the synopsis. We are quickly brought up to speed at the current state of the castle where most if not all of this book occurs. Amar Castle has been under siege for over 6 months, which means much needed resources have not been making it into the castle. Amar Castle was designed to protect 300 people at a time, and at this point there are 3 times that within its walls. The enemy just surrounds the castle and waits for its demise. One of our main characters, Focine, is introduced to us very early in this chapter. She is referred to by the king as his madwoman, and we definitely get the feeling that she has something witchy going on with her. She has a couple of companions that even she has no idea what they are. She refers to them as serpents at one point, but they seem to lurk in shadows and in impossibly small spaces. She considers them friendly but untrustworthy, which cats, am I right? Up to this point, Focine has been able to kind of stay out of the crush of bodies that now inhabit this castle and is left alone to make miracles happen. And she actually did accomplish this. She found a way, even she's not sure how, to purify drinking water. So awesome, but the king is of course not satisfied by this. They are still going to run out of food within 15 days, more likely closer to 3 days. So he needs a solution, and he calls upon Focine in her quarters to see her at work. And what he's met with is just the general disarray that she lives in. When a fight breaks out in the courtyard below, we are, I think, introduced to another character. I mean, we're not introduced to them, but we get our first glimpse of one of the other main characters. I don't know if I'm gonna like this comparison in the future once I have gotten further into this book, but I was immediately so excited because Sir Voin is described as having a half-shaved head and then a luxurious braid on the other side. And so of course, immediately, it's me! We first see this character in action when a fight breaks out in the courtyard, and immediately there is some sort of bloody response to this happening. So I think that that character is more of a guardsman. I believe she's part of the King's Guard, and upon the king seeing Focine's lack of progress, he is assigning Sir Voin to essentially keep eyes on her and what she's doing and making sure that progress is happening. So what will the solution be? I don't know. That's where chapter 1 is left. The rest of the synopsis reveals that there is definitely a sapphic thread throughout this. And from Mara's description, there was some allusion to possibly resorting to cannibalism to solve this food crisis. So I'm not quite sure what to expect, but I am super intrigued by what I read. So I am going to give this one a 9.5 out of 10. Super intriguing, super gritty. Great characters already. I have to get to it. I have to get to this one. So that is going to wrap up this edition of my first chapter project. We tried 7 chapters, 3 of which were absolutely fantastic. And I hope you're as excited about them as I am. Let me know in the comments if you add any of these to your TBR, or let me know if you have any May releases that you're looking forward to. Once again, thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, goodbye. Dun dun dun.